Hello guys, welcome to another video, and this one I wanted to do a bit of discussion on a brand new support gem that was added to the game in this patch, a brand new exceptional support gem, that is the Vaal Temptation support. Now this gem drops exclusively from the Trialmaster boss fight, that's the one from Ultimatum, and let's have a look at what this gem does. So it says, using supported Vaal skills inflicts Vaal Temptation on you, dealing 1,300 to 1,500 physical damage per second instead of applying soul gain prevention. So this number actually scales down based on the gem level, and at the maximum level of a corrupted gem, which is level 4, that's going to deal 1,200 physical damage per second to you. And notably, this is something that replaces the soul gain prevention, but it lasts the same time as the soul gain prevention would have lasted, and it also can stack. So you can spam your Vaal skill if you have enough souls, but you will incur multiple of these debuffs that will continuously deal physical damage over time to you. Now let's discuss some ways that you can make use of this support gem, because right now I think this is extremely slept on. It is such a good support gem. So first of all, we have the Vaal Discipline skill, and you can link this straight up to that support gem, and what Vaal Discipline does is it prevents your energy shield recharge from being delayed by damage. So whilst the buff is actually active, any damage that you take, it won't stop the recharge. And energy shield recharge is a base recovery for energy shield, and it usually starts after 2 seconds, and it recovers at a baseline of 33% per second. So if you have, 5,000 energy shield, it will recharge 1,650 per second. 5,000 is a bit low though for an average energy shield build. Let's say you have 10,000 energy shield, that's 3,300 energy shield recovered per second from recharge. And even 10,000 is a bit low these days, so at 15,000 energy shield, it's 4,950 energy shield recovered per second. So that is a lot of recovery that you get from having your energy shield recharge up, but energy shield recharge is balanced around the idea that it gets delayed by taking damage. Now, if you have enough energy shield, that means that your baseline recharge will be able to cover that downside of the damage taken from the support gem. So just by having enough energy shield, you can already just make use of this support gem, and it means that you're gaining just pure positive upside from using that. Because you have a constant Vaal Discipline, obviously you need to pay the soul cost, but as long as you have enough souls, you can continuously use this, and you'll be able to benefit from that recovery. However, let's kind of delve a bit more into this idea, because obviously this is a 3-second duration. You're going to want to scale it up a little bit in terms of duration. That will also scale the soul gain prevention, so when you actually use Vaal Discipline a second time, it will overlap that damage from the support gem. And as I said, on a level 4 gem there, that's 1,200 a second. So sometimes you're going to be taking 2 lots of this buff, and that's going to be 2,400 physical damage per second being taken at a time, which is quite a lot of damage, but you're going to be able to out-recover that with the energy shield recharge. But you can invest into this a little bit further. As I said, you're going to want to scale this duration up. You can do that with modifiers on the skill tree. You can use the more duration support, for example. And that means that you're going to have a longer window of time to actually gain the souls. We will talk about gaining souls a little bit later in this video, and how you can kind of lower this cost and things like that. But you're going to buy yourself more time to be able to gain souls, so you can continuously chain this skill back to back. But you can also scale up your energy shield recharge. It's not fixed at 33%. You can do that with modifiers to energy shield recharge rate, and you can also do that with modifiers to energy shield recovery rate. Now, there's a couple of interesting options that you have here. There's the Beast Fur Shawl. I will just mention this one. I don't think many people are actually going to use this because it's not a very good body armor, but it does have up to 100% increased energy shield recovery rate. Now, this is a separate multiplier to energy shield recharge rate. So, for example, if you had 100% increased energy shield recharge rate, that would bring your recharge from 33% to 66%. And then if you had this modifier on a max roll of 100%, that would bring your recharge from 66% up to 132%, which is obviously just an absurd amount of recovery at that point. So I wanted to mention this just because this is a separate multiplier, and this is a huge amount of this stat. Usually you don't get this stat in very large quantities. There is, for example, a mastery on the passive tree on the energy shield and evasion wheel, which grants you 20% increased energy shield recovery rate if you haven't been hit recently. But there's also the Blightwell unique amulet there, which is up to 200% increased energy shield recharge rate during flask effect, and I think this also scales with catalyst quality as well, so you can get up to 240%. And that does mean that you need to ensure you have a flask up all the time, but this is a crazy amount of increased energy shield recharge rate. Once again, you can't really get this stat in huge quantities like this in the game. You can get it on energy shield gear pieces, for example, as a suffix, and you can get it on the passive tree. For example, there's a wheel on the passive tree that grants, I think, about 60% in total for 3 points. But this is an absurd amount, so I wanted to mention that one as well. And with all of those things together, you're going to be able to push up your recovery very high to the point where you just gain such a huge amount out of keeping this up all the time. You can completely out-heal the damage coming in from the Vaal Temptation support, and then on top of that, you have a huge amount of recovery that's going to be up all the time, as long as you can pay that soul cost every time you need to reuse the skill. Now, something else that's interesting there as well in regards to Vaal Discipline is Eternal Youth, which makes it so that you recharge life instead of energy shield. Now, what this does is it applies that 33% recharge to scale off of life instead. So, for example, if you had 5,000 life, you'd have 1,650 life recharge. And you can continue to scale that recharge with the modifiers to increase energy shield recharge rate like you could before. But importantly, it's no longer affected by energy shield recovery rate because, of course, this is no longer energy shield, it's now life. But you can scale it with life recovery rate. So things like the Elder Belt modifier, for example, for life recovery rate, that would work to scale up that recovery. And importantly, this does work with Vaal Discipline. So this will prevent your life recharge from being delayed by damage. So you can make a life build with this tech. It's not completely exclusive to Energy Shield. If you want to, you can make use of Eternal Youth, you can make use of Vaal Discipline linked to Vaal Temptation, and that will actually work. Now let's discuss the damage from Vaal Temptation for a moment, because this deals physical damage over time to you, which is a damage type that is quite difficult to mitigate, but there are some ways that you can go about doing that. Firstly, there are some rarer modifiers for damage taken as in the game, which also factor in damage over time. Most of them are only for hits, but there are some that work for damage over time as well. One of those is the Cloak of Flame, so 40% of physical damage taken as fire damage. Conveniently, there's also the Volatile Vaal Orb in the game this patch, which means that this number can go to 49% on a max roll, but let's just take this armor as it is right now, that's 40%. Then you have the Dawnbreaker unique shield, which can roll up to 20% of the same stat. That also includes damage over time. And there's also the Bound by Destiny unique jewel there. On the 4 influence item bonus, you can roll one of 3 modifiers, all of which grant you physical damage taken as a particular element. And let's just stick with the fire damage one here, so that's up to 10% of physical damage taken as fire damage if 4 Warlord items are equipped. Now that would mean that you have a total 70% physical damage taken as fire, which also includes damage over time. You could use this on an ascendancy like the Chieftain, for example, which is going to want to scale maximum fire resistance, and let's say you have 90% fire resistance. Now what that would mean is that at the level 4 gem there of 1200 physical damage taken per second, having 70% of physical damage taken as fire would lower this number down to 444 taken per second. That's because 70% of it is being mitigated by the 90% fire resistance and basically goes to almost nothing. And then the rest is being taken still as physical damage, and you've almost cut 2/3 off of that damage taken per second. And there's other ways that you can mitigate this as well. For example, endurance charges are a great option. They provide additional physical damage reduction and additional elemental damage reduction. So for the normal incoming damage there of physical damage, you can make use of the additional physical damage reduction there to mitigate that damage. And of course, in the setup that we just discussed there, where some of it is being taken as fire, that part also gets mitigated further by the additional elemental damage reduction as well. So that's one thing you can do there. You can stack up some endurance charges to provide some more mitigation for that downside. And one skill that I really want to discuss here, which I think is incredibly good synergy with the Vaal Temptation support gem, is Aspect of the Crab. Now, this is an aspect skill, and you can get it on a level 30 version, which gains an extra 2 max crab barriers there, so a little bit more mitigation coming in. And with those 12 crab barriers, you will gain 2% per for up to 24% additional physical damage reduction. Now, the cool thing about this skill is that it does work for incoming physical damage over time, because this is additional physical damage reduction, and it's only removed when you actually take a hit. So when you take a hit of physical damage, this will be mitigated by this additional physical damage reduction, and then all of those crab stacks will be lost and you have to build them up again. But if you don't get hit and you don't take that damage, this is just there all of the time. Which means if you have a build that has very good avoidance layers, things like block, evasion, dodge, outright damage avoidance, or projectile avoidance, and these sort of things, then you're going to be able to keep this up longer and you can benefit from that damage reduction on the incoming damage more of the time. So that is a really good option there because it provides such a huge amount of additional physical damage reduction. Beyond that, you also have the Pantheon options there. For the Major God, you have Arakali for 10% reduced damage taken from damage over time. Notably, this is reduced damage taken. It doesn't stack on the same layer as, for example, Endurance Charges, which is damage reduction. But the Soul of Lunaris and the Soul of Solaris, those ones do stack with additional physical damage reduction from Endurance Charges because that's what they provide. So you could use those instead if you wanted to. And for the Minor God there, you have Radhakesh, which is 25% reduced physical damage over time taken while moving. That is a ridiculous amount of reduction coming in there. If you have a build that moves a lot, which is most builds, that is going to be really, really strong. And keep in mind that that there is a damage taken modifier, so that stacks additively with the Soul of Arakali. And it also stacks additively with the Fortify Mastery for 10% reduced damage over time taken while you have at least 20 fortifications, so that's quite strong as well. That's something else you could look into. And beyond that, there is the buffed Boon of the Mountain there from the Olroth bloodline for 50% less damage taken over time while you have Unbroken Ward. Again, that's another option. And one of the last things I'll mention is an interesting Anoint-only node. It's called Hardened Scars. This is something that could be used in combination with the Pathfinder, where you have a permanent life flask up all of the time. That is 15% less damage over time taken during the effect of any life flask. So again, that's a huge amount of damage reduction for that incoming physical damage over time. And I would also mention that you can get kind of generic damage reduction. For example, the Slayer's Brutal Fervor there is 10% reduced damage taken while leeching. That just applies to everything. And that's also additive with the reduced damage taken from the Fortify Mastery and the Pantheons. Now, once you have a good amount of mitigation and things like that, you could consider stacking up a lot of recovery to just completely out-recover the incoming damage. So one option there, which is quite interesting, I think, is the Tainted Pact Amulet, because of the ridiculous amount of recovery you can obtain with this thing. And if you don't know how that works, this says taking chaos damage over time heals you instead while leeching life. So as long as you're leeching, this is usually used on a Slayer, for example, so you can have that overleech all the time, and you have long duration leech as well. And you combine that with the Golden Rule, and you then use it on a build that is able to output poison. You reflect those poisons back to yourself, and as long as the poisons have less duration than your leech, that means that you never kind of have leech falling off, so the chaos damage starts to deal damage. Instead, it's just healing you all the time. Then you have, sort of mediocre amount of chaos resistance, which means that you actually recover a lot of health from that incoming poison damage. But even beyond that, you have options, for example, like Juggernaut Trauma stacking, which can also achieve massive amounts of recovery. Now, something else I want to mention in regards to the Vaal Temptation support gem there is the option of using this one alongside Hateforge. So Hateforge are some unique gloves. These also come from the Trialmaster, so if you're in SSF, for example, and you want to farm that support gem, you could also try and farm these gloves. I think these are quite rare, though. And these ones have the modifier Vaal attack skills you use yourself cost rage instead of requiring souls. And they also say you cannot gain rage during soul gain prevention. Well, the use of the support gem completely removes soul gain prevention from the equation. That's no longer a thing. So you'll always be able to gain rage. And the Vaal attack skills now cost rage instead of requiring souls. You can do some shenanigans there with the combination of Rot Blood Promise and Chains of Emancipation. You can basically make it so that you always top off your rage back to maximum pretty much every time you end up using a skill that costs rage. And if you have enough recovery and enough mitigation for that Vaal Temptation support gem there, that means that you're going to be able to use Hateforge to spam a skill like Vaal Lightning Strike. So you're going to be able to continuously spam that skill and get loads of these out. These are duration-based skills, so they last quite a long time and they continuously deal damage. And, if you have enough recovery and things like that to be able to counter that downside of constantly taking physical damage, that is something that you could look at. Now, we've discussed a lot of the recovery and mitigating damage and things like that for this new support gem, but something else to discuss, of course, is the soul cost, because when it comes to non-Vaal attack skills, you can't use things like Hateforge. You are going to have to actually pay that soul cost. So let's take a look at the ways that you could lower the soul cost or gain more souls. Firstly, you have the Chaos Bloodline. Once again, this comes from the Trialmaster, so a lot of things are revolving around that boss. And there's a couple of interesting options here. There is the Priest of Yalmak, which I think is the most notable one. This one reduces soul gain prevention duration by 20%. That means that the debuff duration that deals physical damage over time to you is going to be lower. So that is really important. It means that you're basically going to accrue less stacking debuffs over time. And that could mean you can have, more occurring effects like the Vaal Lightning Strike without having to take so much damage. There's also the 30% less soul cost per use there, which isn't going to be useful in regards to Hateforge, but it is going to be useful for what we were first talking about in this video, which was the Vaal Discipline aura, which does cost a lot of souls, so that's going to cut that soul cost down by 30%, which is quite good. And you have a bit of a bonus chance there, a 20% chance to regain consumed souls, which is quite nice. You can combine that with the Corrupted Jewel for another 20% of that same stat. And another option there you can look at is the Priest of Kamasa, which is 50% increased skill effect duration for Vaal skills. It also makes them have increased aura effect, which isn't too useful for the Vaal Discipline. But this one is basically going to have the other effects where the skill lasts longer, which means that you have a longer window of time to actually gain souls. But what's usually going to happen with this setup here is that you're basically going to have longer windows of time where you're taking multiple stacking damage debuffs. Do keep in mind that there is the 1 Vaal soul gained per second on the small node there, which is quite useful, and you can also use the Rune Graft of the Soul Wick for another 1 Vaal soul per second. So that's a way to kind of passively generate souls even out of combat. I don't think you're going to have many problems keeping up these skills in maps where you're able to just kill so many monsters all the time and you gain so many souls. But in terms of sort of single target options, it might be a bit of an issue, so you want to look at other ways to gain souls. And something you could look into is the Soul Ripper flasks there, which makes it so that you lose all of the charges when you actually use the flask, and you gain the amount of flask charges as Vaal souls. So that's a way to instantly gain a huge chunk of Vaal souls, then you can just immediately use your skill. And something else there is the Soul Catcher, which is another way to reduce the soul gain prevention duration. But keep in mind that that does prevent you from gaining mana, so that is quite restrictive in terms of build. Now, one of the last things I want to mention in this video is that I have done a bit of testing with this support gem, and this does not count as a debuff. So it's not lowered by things like Debuff Expiry rate, for example. You can't equip a Warp Timepiece and suddenly have this disappearing at a really fast rate. It does stay there for the entire duration that the Vaal soul gain prevention would have lasted, but that does mean that this is affected by things when you're using a skill, for example, like Vaal Discipline, where it says modifiers to skill effect duration also apply to Vaal soul gain prevention. That means that the skill effect duration does apply to that. So if you're scaling it up, for example, with Vaal Discipline, it's going to make the soul gain prevention last longer, which means you take damage for longer. But that's pretty much going to be it for this video. I wanted to mention this because I think this is a really, really slept on support gem right now. For example, we have 124,000 characters catalogued on PoE Ninja right here. And how many people are using this support gem? 118 characters. That is ridiculous. Barely anybody using this. I think most people are using it for the Vaal Discipline thing, like Aura bots and things like that, which makes sense because it's very strong for that. But I think there are other uses for this, which are quite powerful. And hopefully, with this video, you'll gain a bit of inspiration to build around this support gem, because this is a fun one. But that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.